Good afternoon. I'm Bill Kennedy, the GIC's Vice Chair of Programs, and I'll serve as your host today. On behalf of the Global Interdependent Center's Board of Directors, welcome to today's executive briefing. Today, we will explore criminal justice reform and specifically second chance hiring practices and their impact on labor markets and economic growth. Our guest is Jeffrey Korzenik, friend of the GIC and author of a new book titled Untapped Talent: How Second Chance Hiring Works for Your Business and the Community. Jeffrey Korzenik is the Chief Investment Strategist for Fifth Third Bank based in Chicago. He is a regular guest on CNBC, Bloomberg, and Fox Business News, and his writings on economics and public policy have appeared in numerous national and regional publications. Jeff was recently elected a member of the Council on Criminal Justice for his work on the intersection of the justice system and the labor markets. Jeff, welcome to the executive briefing.
Thank you very much. And don't forget, I'm also a member of the GIC too, not just a friend.
Absolutely. We're very pleased to have you with us today. So we're going to have our program as a fireside chat, and we've had a chance to review the book. But when we set up today's conference, the title we landed on was Why Criminal Justice Reform is Good for Business. So why don't we start there? Is it really good for business? And if so, how?
You know, it's really good for business because we waste enormous amounts of talent in the United States by getting people falling into justice involvement, getting arrested, sometimes getting incarcerated, and getting into just a cycle of absolute waste and very hard to get back in the economy. We all know that one of the pillars of economic growth is how fast you can grow your workforce, and we are losing too much of our population to the criminal justice system. So reform has the opportunity to avoid some of those bad consequences, and in doing so, provide us a labor force that we're going to need, and then also, very importantly, stop wasting money that we are frittering away, keeping people incarcerated or in this revolving door of the justice system. And then there's a more subtle answer to this as well, that the business community, I think, is being challenged today, and the free enterprise system is being challenged today to solve societal problems. And second chance hiring and criminal justice reform that is oriented towards better economic outcomes and employment of people who have been involved in the justice system will lead to much better, stronger communities and more prosperous communities. And so I think it's important that the business community also recognize that they need to be very publicly associated with solving societal problems. And this is a heck of a good place to start.
Great. So there's several components there that we'd like to dig into, but before we do that, you and I have been around the capital markets for probably longer than we'd like to admit, but how does a famous, well-regarded, established market strategist get involved in this topic, in criminal justice, and what was the catalyst for you writing this book?
Fifth Third is a little bit unusual in that we have no one at the bank with the title economist. So I'm the de facto economist, and it makes sense. You can't understand the investment markets without understanding the economy, and the economic trends that have interested me in particular were labor market trends. And these became very important around 2013, 2014, when many of the viewers today will remember that the big topic was declining labor force participation rates, or low labor force participation rates, and the way that that was impeding US growth and a recovery. And I started looking very hard at who was missing from the labor force. We all understood the older end of the baby boomers would retire out, but we had many millions who were missing. And I came to the conclusion that it was social ills were impacting the labor force in ways that we had never seen in post-World War II America. So these weren't really just societal issues, they were economic issues. Long-term unemployment, the opioid epidemic, and the incarceration recidivism cycle. And around the same time, I stumbled into companies that had broken this cycle. They had figured out ways to do second chance hiring, giving people with criminal records, often right out of prison, the opportunity to become productive employees. and these models worked. And so I started talking about these models and recognizing these experiences as something that could be passed on and shared, and I realized the book was really the best way to get that done.
Fantastic. So it sounds like you had a lot of support from your employer and trying to tackle this from a growth and labor perspective. It is very interesting. Give us a little bit of perspective of the issues facing labor participation. How big is the incarceration issue, and just generally, what's the scale of our issue here?
Yeah, well, one of the things you quickly learn when you get into the employment of people with criminal records is there's limited data, but we can piece together things. There's things that have gotten more refined in the last couple of years. The number I focus on is that there are 19 million Americans with a felony conviction, and there are many millions more, we don't know how many millions more with misdemeanor convictions. And that's, you couple that with the fact that the felony conviction in particular is a formidable barrier to unemployment. So you see things like estimates, and this goes back to 2018 in tight labor markets, that the average unemployment rate of people who had been incarcerated was 27%. And in the year following exiting incarceration, the unemployment rate for those people is typically north of 50%. You add that up and you get this picture of those 19 million, of course, 1 to 2 million are currently incarcerated. Some have aged out of the labor force, but you have millions who are either simply out of the labor force, who are unemployed but actively seeking employment, or those who are, and some who are employed, but even among those who are employed, there's a tremendous loss of labor mobility. You can't move up the ladder or can't move into every profession that would be the best fit for your skill set. So there's a huge issue of underemployment in this group, and it's truly an economic issue when you size it in that way.
And so, arguably, not all 17 or 19 million could make their way back into the labor force. In an ideal environment, would this be a 3% pickup in the labor force, a 5% growth rate? Do you have a?
Yeah, so no one really knows, and so it's just a guess, but you're probably talking a couple of percent increase in total labor force. So let's say, of those 19 million, you're probably talking at least 5 million who could be better employed, maybe closer to 10 million who could be truly better employed. And in a labor force of 160 odd million right now, that's a meaningful pickup. The other factor is people who are coming out of prison. So we have about 620 to 640,000 people come out of prison every year. And the rearrest rate is absolutely horrendous there, just to give you a sense of how we waste this talent. So of those who exit prison within 5 years, more than 76% are rearrested. Doesn't mean reconvicted, doesn't mean re-incarcerated, but you get this sense of a revolving door and a waste of talent, as well as the money associated with that. So it's a very real number. And then there are the things that are really hard to quantify. What you come to understand when you look at this is the weight of the criminal justice system, and having a felony conviction is so great on certain communities, it becomes an intergenerational problem. Having a parent who's been incarcerated is a big predictor of a child ultimately becoming incarcerated. There's a loss of transmission of kind of the basic skills of work. I learned how to work hard and show up on time and dress appropriately and navigate issues at work because I had father who modeled that way. A lot of these communities have been so impacted, they don't have those role models. Just to give you some numbers, 1 in 3 Black men in America have a felony conviction. I mean, that's a stunning number, and really has had a devastating impact on those communities, not just in kind of the obvious ways, but also in this sense of creating intergenerational problems. So if we can break that cycle, and frankly, I don't see how we can break it without second chance hiring, we can break that cycle, we get all sorts of additional economic wins.
And have you tried to quantify that in terms of, we know we have a trend GDP growth issue. And we heard last week from Dr. Goodhart and Dr. Pradhan, who spoke about the demographic story globally, but the aging population of the workforce around the world, including in the United States, is starting to have an impact on trend growth. Any thought if that the 5 million or whatever the hypothetical number to come back into the labor force, how could that impact trend growth?
Yeah, I mean, one way to look at it, first of all, is that you're lifting your base case for trend growth. So, growth off of what base? And if we can, for instance, to grow during the growth years, the kind of normalized growth years of 2017, 18, 19, we were adding about 2.5 million workers a year. We're kind of running out. So if we can add 5 million more workers, and again, there's a skills mismatch issue and things like that, you're talking about 2 more years of growth. A 2% growth, $20 trillion economy, that's talking $400 billion a year of additional GDP. And 2 years of that is 800 billion. So you're lifting your base case. But on thinking instead in terms of having better outcomes for people coming out of prison, you're probably talking 0.1%, faster growth, which makes a real difference over time. And then that's in kind of the pure labor force growth model, not talking about the after effects of better use of government resources, better improvements of opportunities in these afflicted communities. So there's no nice, clean econometric answer, but I think that gives you a sense of the numbers we're talking about. It's not going to make the US economy go from a 2% growth rate to a 4% growth rate. The numbers are not of that magnitude, but they are certainly significant. And I think part and parcel of it is not just the growth of the workforce, but you're probably talking about much better productivity outcomes. I'll be honest, I'm trying to wrap my arms around what that looks like. It's pretty hard. There's some suggestive studies. University of Michigan looked at people who had their records expunged. So you have a person with visible record, then you take that same person 2 years later after the record is expunged, and they showed a pickup of income of 25% on average. So some combination of people who were unemployed getting employed, people who were employed but had low labor force mobility were able to move up. And that gives you a little bit of a sense of the magnitude that we might be able to discuss. It's very powerful in all sorts of ways. I try to be conservative with the numbers, and I still come up with hundreds of billions of dollars in value added to the economy.
Great, thank you for that. So I want to turn to one of the chapters in your book where you talk about the importance of language. Language matters. Labels matter. Criminal, convict, felon. Seems like and I've heard you say this a couple of times now, people with a record. Can you just walk us through?
Sure.
What is the appropriate titling that we should be thinking about as potential employers?
Yeah, and I want to be very careful about this. I think language matters. It doesn't matter a ton, right? It matters, and we should always use people first language and humanizing language. But I'm also very wary of, I can't tell you how many times I've been scolded for language because everyone has an opinion on this. And sometimes people who are eager to participate in reform latch on to language use because it's something they can do, and they make it off-putting and shut down productive conversation. So I as you saw in the book, I used an example of an employer in Wheaton, Illinois, western suburbs of Chicago, and he started a company to employ a post-prison population. And he's done all sorts of wonderful, good things. He's had, I think, 70 people move through their program or something like that over the years, and really transformed lives. And he gathered everyone together because he was very conscious of the language issues. You know, what do I call you? And they all said, oh, we're felons, just call us by our name. And the people who really have these records tend just to want to be treated as we all do, with dignity and given opportunities. But I will tell you, I use the term second chance a lot. People in need of a second chance, people with records, people with criminal records. What I don't like to use is felon, right? Because technically someone who has committed and been convicted of a felony, or whether they committed or not, but convicted of a felony, is a felon for life, even if you never were incarcerated. About half of all people with felony convictions never even had to serve a prison term as offense of such minor threat to public safety. So, you know, that's really wrong, that you know, you always have the label, no matter what you've done in life since that period. That strikes me as very wrong. People talk about returning citizens. To me, that means people who have come from incarceration, but so many people with convictions never even had to serve a prison term. So that doesn't capture all of them. So I just settle with people with records. Some reformers like to use justice-involved individuals. That's a little bit too much of a tongue twister. You know, what I always figure is, if I can engage a business decision maker in the conversation, I don't care what language they use. If they really end up caring about this, they'll find the right language. And the more important thing is to have the substantive conversation about how do you provide opportunities in a way that works for the business.
Great. And I learned about two pieces of legislation, which I think get to the heart of the policy around second chance hiring. The first, well, there is the Second Chance Act, which was actually the first act, and then there was the First Step Act. I think the Second Chance Act was 2007, 2008, and the
signed in
First Step Act was after that. Can you just compare and contrast those two acts? Help the audience understand what those are.
They're important because they were the first federal legislation in a long time to look at outcomes of people who have left incarceration. So the Second Chance Act was the biggest part of that act is to provide grants to reentry organizations, including non-governmental nonprofits, that help foster better outcomes for people who've been incarcerated. And it was a recognition that we have this terrible problem where people once incarcerated tend to become reincarcerated or rearrested in huge numbers, and it was meant to fund efforts through grants throughout the United States to address that problem. The First Step Act, which was bipartisan legislation signed by President Trump, was probably the most meaningful justice reform since the 90s, and it also had a flavor of and a focus on giving people opportunities who've been incarcerated. For one, it did re-up the Second Chance Act, so that was part of it. It had some sentencing reforms, looking at mandatory minimums and reducing those for federal law. And the First Step Act is purely federal legislation. The Second Chance Act allowed block grants to states, so it had greater impact than just the federal prison system. But the First Step Act was meant to show leadership in the federal prison system, which is only about 7 or 8% of all prisoners are in the federal system, but what the feds do can influence what the states do. And so sentencing reform, reducing mandatory minimums or providing an out for that, some treatment reforms like no shackling of pregnant women inmates, but a lot of it was focused on requiring federal prison authorities to develop models to assist reentry. You know, things like documentation. So you walk out of prison with a plan and restoration of ID and maybe birth certificate and things that become essential to getting reestablished. And then it also did offer good time credits. It extended some good time credits to give greater incentives for people who are behind bars to participate in some of this programming. It all sounds like a lot of minor stuff, but it is such a break with the past, and had such great bipartisan support that it really is significant, even though it covers a fairly small part of the prison population.
Understood. So it's interesting, the uninformed narrative would have suggested, this is probably more the Democratic Party than the Republican Party in support of this type of reform, but suggesting it's truly bipartisan, both sides of the aisle supporting these types of policies. Is that right?
Yeah, just to give you a flavor of it, the First Step Act passed the Senate 87-12. I mean, that's very, very bipartisan, and the lines have blurred over the decades. And the old paradigm of you're either tough on crime or you're soft on crime really doesn't work. We should all be in favor of public safety and of opportunity for individuals, and those actually go hand in hand. And there's greater bipartisan recognition of it. I will say that it's been interesting to me as someone who's really pretty apolitical. Different parties bring different strengths. I would say if you did make a generalization, if I were in prison wanting services or going through, arrested, going through the criminal justice system, I'd want Democrats to set the rules of the game, because they tend to have do better with some of that. On the other hand, when I'm out and looking for a job, I want the Republicans to be writing the rules, because they seem to have a greater sensitivity to the concerns of small businesses in particular, and overcoming some of those barriers. So it's one of those areas where we really need both political perspectives to come to the right answer.
Understood. Well, the GIC is here to deliver neutral forums to talk about these issues, and we always focus on the interdependencies. In this case, the interdependency of these policies to economic growth and economic activity. So let's get into a little bit of the meat and potatoes, if you will, of the second chance hiring. When does second chance employment, when does it work and when does it fail?
Sure. And the interdependence theme is really important here, because the model, one of the reasons it has failed so dismally is we've been too siloed in this. The business community wasn't talking to government agencies, who weren't talking to nonprofits. And the model works best when you have an employer that has made a conscious commitment to this kind of hiring and understands that they need to establish two processes. One is a process for identifying who is truly ready for employment. And two, they need a process for understanding any accommodations or gaps that need to be filled in the lives of these employees so that they can thrive as workers. And to do that effectively, you need partnerships. And some of those partnerships are with nonprofits, sometimes with government, sometimes with combinations of them. That's the model that makes the most business sense. When you do that, you find out who's ready to rebuild their lives, and you give them the tools to thrive, you get not just an employee of last resort, not just an adequate employee. You actually get a superior employee as measured by engagement and loyalty. And the combination of high engagement and staying with one employer turns into productivity, and productivity turns into profitability. So you do need to make an investment here. It's not always a financial investment, because there's so many resources from governments and nonprofits to support what the employer is trying to do, but it's absolutely an investment in terms of education, putting together a plan, finding out, rejiggering that plan to work for the specific needs of the business. But the payoff is very high. I was on a call with a very successful second chance employer in Ohio, and he shared with me, he said, people, this population is more work up front, but they're worth it. And that's been the universal theme of people who follow that model.
So is that to say, if don't put that emphasis up front, there's a higher probability that it fails. So are there any other factors that lead to unsuccessful examples?
You know, that's the model of success there, but there are other models that are out there. A very common model. One of the challenges here is a lot more employers than I think the reform community initially thought have tried it. They've tried hiring people with records and it's failed. So the failures come in a couple of forms. There is the what I refer to as the disposable employee model. This you find sometimes in certain maintenance businesses, in certain fast food businesses, where what you're doing is just hiring sort of a replaceable human being who's cheap. And there are tax credits available for a period of time, the work opportunity tax credit and certain training credits that employers do avail themselves of when you hire from this population. But those employers who follow this disposable model are really hiring the people just for the cheapness, right? Just for the reimbursement, the fact that you'll get someone who can do the job while they happen to last, and there's no long-term commitment of support of the employee. There's not a lot of selectivity, those models, so you get high turnover and you don't get a highly engaged individual universally. I don't condemn those models because at least they're offering a job and it's a chance for someone that's better than no chance whatsoever. But I don't think it optimizes profitability, particularly as we get into demographically destined tighter labor markets. That loyalty factor is very important. The other model is one that I think more employers have had an experience with. I call it the undifferentiated model. And that's you gave someone a shot. He has a criminal record, but interviewed well, let's give it a try. And it's really hard to assess someone's character in a fairly short job interview. The models I suggest, partnering with nonprofits, allow nonprofits to build a relationship and help you identify who's truly ready for employment. If you just give it a shot, maybe you have someone who's ready to rebuild their life, maybe you don't. Even if you find the person who is truly committed, those employers who follow that model don't understand the gaps that are present. So it might be someone who's never had a mentor before and doesn't know what to do if their car breaks down. Car breaks down, you or I, if we had a place of business to go to, would call and say, I'm sorry, my car broke down. I'll be late. I'll get an Uber or a Lyft, or I'll come in tomorrow after I get the car repaired. From this population, the car breaks down and there may not be $300 in the bank to take the car repair. This is an example actually given to me by an employer, and they may not know what to do. They may simply say, oh, I guess I don't work anymore, and they don't show up. So you need an employer who understands that this population has gaps that you and I and the viewers today may not have, but are very real to them. And so those employers have the experience of sometimes it works out and you get all the benefits of a good model, highly engaged, loyal employee. But you get about an equal number of people who just don't show up someday because something happened that distracted them, they didn't know how to handle it. Or they've never accepted or had criticism because they've never had constructive criticism because they've never had that experience in their life, and they blow up, have an emotional management issue. Or, and these are real life examples, someone at the water cooler says, so where'd you come from? And they're so ashamed and embarrassed and don't have the language to answer that they just don't show up. So there's a complexity there that you can solve for. Employers do solve for these things, but you can't go in blindly.
Great. As we were doing our prep call for today's, you and I had a quick conversation, and we were talking about what data has been collected through second chance hiring. And one of the questions I had was, is there any signal from the type of offense from the employee that would suggest success or no success in the workplace? Can you just talk through that a little bit? A couple of observations you shared I thought were interesting.
Well, again, one of the reasons that we have not had more success is there's an inherent mismatch. If you ask any employer who's not looked into this, what kind of second chance employee do you want? I'll always hear, nonviolent drug offense. Well, it turns out that nonviolent drug offenses are, on average, and I have to stress this, one of your worst potential candidates, because often they reflect a substance abuse disorder that may not be resolved and makes them unsuccessful. The truth, I don't know if you want to say ugly truth, surprising truth, the truth is that the single best success is with people who have been convicted for non-premeditated murder. And I would never lead with an employer saying, here's who you should hire. But the reality is that people who were convicted of offenses of violence and weren't repeat offenders were often there not because they were inherently violent people even back then, but young men, sometimes under the influence of alcohol and drugs, high emotions, wrong place, wrong time, and something happened. One of the best second chance employers I know is in Philadelphia, Brown Superstores. Jeff Brown has 500 second chance employees out of 2,300 or so in his workforce. And, Jeff observed to me, he said, a lot of these guys are in the drug trade. If you're in the drug trade, you need to protect your inventory. If you protect your inventory, you do it by carrying a gun. Young men carrying guns, something happens sooner or later. And so people who've been convicted of crimes of violence tend to be put away for a long period of time. And one of the best characteristics of success is it's well known among criminologists that people age out of crime. And so if people have been away for a long time, when they come out, they have aged, matured, neurologically matured, and are far likelier, if they want to turn their life around, to be in a position to do so. But the reality is there's no universal indicator. And what I stress to employers is you have to do a truly individualized assessment. And I think from a starting point, you can start with nonviolent offenses. You always want to have a nonviolent person, but sometimes nonviolent people today, 20 years ago, were either violent or in the wrong place at the wrong time. But there are ways that you start slowly and have to look at every single case on a case-by-case basis. And the law actually requires that kind of individualized assessment. A lot of firms don't do it, but when they do it, they come to understand that people get justice involvement for all sorts of reasons. But age is a good predictor. I don't know if it's the crime itself or the fact that you've been put away for a long time, but crimes of violence should generally not be excluded. Yes, at the start you may need to exclude that. You always want to exclude people who are violent today, but I would, as an employer, I would look closely.
Yeah, fascinating. So I have one more question, and then we're going to turn it over to the audience Q&A. But before we do that, you talk about several case studies in the book, and I'd like you to address one in particular, which I think was in one of the chapters. That was the JBM packing company. Walk through that as a case study.
Sure. JBM Packaging is a second-generation family business in Lebanon, Ohio. Lebanon, although it's a county seat, there's no public transit to speak of in town. It's a small population, and this business, about 100 at the time, 120 employees or so, couldn't find workers. And it was slowing their growth. It was becoming a real problem. They had an experienced older workforce that was gradually retiring, and they were trying everything. They tried senior citizens who wanted to go back to work. They tried bringing tours of high school students. And the CEO had no particular interest in justice reform, but at church, someone, they mentioned second chance hiring. And for business reasons, he decided, let's investigate this. And ultimately, they found it incredibly productive. They had a couple of misstarts. They had the good fortune, and they're very generous in their praise of being near a Cincinnati, about 45 minutes to an hour away, company that had really perfected the art of this. So they had kind of proof of concept. And today they recruit heavily from prisons and halfway houses, which are transitional housing for people exiting prison. It has been a fantastic source of growth of their employment base. A couple of nuances around this that I think are important are it was so successful that they ended up setting up a training program in one of the facilities. And it's a remarkable story. They had an employee who had made a mistake, was incarcerated in another state prison. They went to the Ohio State Prison Authorities and said, could you transfer that employee to this facility that happened to have lighting, ventilation, and electricity to support a paper folding machine, which is what this packaging company relies on to a high degree. So they set up their former employee as a trainer. They select people from this facility. They pay them a training stipend. They wanted to be very clear that they were not involved in prison labor, so any goods manufactured in this facility are actually recycled and not sold. And it's created a pipeline of skilled labor and has been very successful. But they have a process for determining who's ready for employment. They start, in many cases, this gives them a chance to look at employees months and quarters before they're released, so they can assess character. They go into other facilities that don't have that, and there's something called the standard timing model. It's used in manufacturing as a way to test aptitude and interest, and they will apply this. They have lines of communication with the prison authorities saying, here's what we're looking for. We're willing to hire, but you have to make sure you're sending us people who are really interested, which was not always the case. Then they have a support infrastructure. They hired one thing that was transformational for them was hiring a life coach. And this is someone who supports not just their second chance workforce, but their entire workforce. And they've created partnerships with nonprofits, transportation needs, housing needs, furniture, clothing for people who just don't have much. And it's resulted in about over 20% of their workforce is now second chance. They call it fair chance. And it's widely recognized among the employees that these are among the hardest workers there. So they overcame a lot of resistance, have a process. It is working. It has allowed the company to absolutely thrive in a time when other employers simply couldn't find workers.
Great example, and definitely a highlight of the book, I think, in terms of what that company's been able to do. Okay, well, that's it for our chat portion. We're going to turn now to audience Q&A. As a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, just go to the panel questions in the GoToWebinar and type in your question. That will put it into the queue. We've had a couple of questions that have come in, so let me start with it's a statement, but you may want to speak to it. There are certain industries that prohibit workers with a record from coming in as employees. Any changes to that or any comment to that, Jeff?
No, that's an important thing. And one of the things that, my book is meant to be a how-to guide for employers. And one of the starting points is find out what the regulations are that govern your industry. And one of the observations that I've made in the book, and I share here, of course, is that invariably people think there are more barriers than actually exist. So, for example, in banking, which is something I'm familiar with, I've always assumed you have a felony, you can't be a banker. And the reality is that there have been exceptions and exemptions that have been carved out historically. The FDIC calls these Section 19 exemptions. And there's even a waiver process so that even if you don't meet these exemptions, you have an opportunity to be granted a waiver. So that is, one kind of typical industry where people believe there's no way you can hire anyone, and there really is a way. And companies like, I spent too many years on Wall Street to ever say something nice about competitors, but I got to say something nice about JP Morgan. They've been very active. They hired over 2,000 people with records last year through a combination of finding people who met the exemptions, or in some cases actually applying for those exemptions themselves. At Fifth Third, we supported an industry move to broaden out the exemptions because they were just too restrictive. And I think that's something you're seeing increasingly, a move towards loosening up those. There's also increased opportunity to use tools which get around those restrictions. So we probably should be using expungement of records more than we do, and there are a number of these clean slate initiatives that will automatically expunge records after certain periods of time if they were certain crimes, low-level crimes, and enough years have passed with no issue with criminal justice. Those are ways of getting around those restrictions. In occupational licensing is a big deal. A lot of licenses, occupational licenses, restrict people with records either very directly or through moral turpitude clauses. And I believe every state has some version of what's broadly called a certificate of rehabilitation. These are things you can petition a court. There's a process for getting a certificate that basically says you are a rehabilitated person. In Illinois, they're called certificates of good conduct, for instance. In Ohio, certificate of qualification for employment. And those get you around those licensing restrictions. And they also are beneficial to employers because it's kind of a safe harbor from negligent hiring liability. Those are too hard to get. They're too costly. You have to wait too many years. But I think improvements on all of those fronts will be very beneficial.
Great, thank you. There's a question, can you talk a bit about training and retooling for this population? I think you addressed this a little bit, but anything that you have seen on the training front?
Sure. I mean, one of the problems historically has been that, you have these programs staffed. There are programs of some level in most prisons. Some do it very well, some do it very poorly. Historically, you had people who hadn't been in the private sector for their whole careers, who'd been in the prison system, developing these programs. So people would walk out with like 2 copies of a paper resume and no computer skills. That fortunately has changed. And there's an effort, again, done better in some states than others, but a growing trend towards providing really good training programs. In Michigan, I visited a prison that had one of their vocational villages, what they call them. They're training centers. They're focused for skilled trades and construction and similar industries. They're taught by guys who come from the unions of Detroit. So there's a good, real life things, and they've developed an excellent track record. They also become, very importantly, show places for bringing the business community in. So DTE, the old Detroit Edison, approached the prison system and helped set up a training program for tree cutters, tree trimmers, right? You have electric power lines, you need to trim trees, and all their tree trimmers were retiring and aging out. So that kind of involvement is good, but it's also newer economy. There's sometimes new nonprofits are more nimble at this. There's a California-based nonprofit, the Last Mile, that focuses on tech training and basically teaching people how to code. They even have a website development shop in one of the California prisons. They've been spreading nationally. Their entrepreneurship programs, so which entrepreneurship is a tough route to go, but it's kind of a, I was always taught on Wall Street, sell the sizzle, not the steak. It's kind of the sizzle to general life training and general kinds of training. What is missing is there's not a lot of political interest in funding these things, right? You're championing people who've committed crimes, and in a limited budget, you're ultimately taking away from programs that might go to people who didn't commit crimes. So it's a tough political thing, but I think there's a growing understanding that this is actually very cost effective, because you're spending $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 to incarcerate someone, and there's this revolving door. Why not spend a couple thousand more and not have them come back? And increasingly, heads of prison programs, and most of this happens at the state level, state prison directors are focusing on reentry opportunities. I'll give just a real quick aside also. and people in our industry, the investment industry, tend to get this. Steve Smith, who's at Brandywine Investments, and people from Ohio may know him from the Stephen Smith Center at Xavier University. Steve heard me speak, came up to me. He's been incredibly supportive. He's sending 500 of my books into prison libraries, because one of the most interesting reactions I've gotten are from letters from prison, as well as people who've been formerly incarcerated. And it took me a while to understand what was going on. When you enter prison, particularly if you are a younger person, you feel a sense of hopelessness and you feel you are a burden. And it does not lead to good behavior. You don't develop yourself, you don't take advantage of opportunities, you maybe get into mischief because you don't see a future. And the book is all about a future for these people. It's not written to people with criminal records, so there's the book starts with a note to the currently incarcerated. And so Steve has generously funded this. There's a nonprofit in Utah we're using for distribution called Books Inside. And so far, I mean, the book just came out. We've sent 400 books to prisons and jails, and we're actually going to re-up an order. And I've got another philanthropist who's generously offered to help because the demand is outstripping the supply.
Great, thank you for that. Just two more questions here, and then we'll be out of time. The rate of growth for imprisonment for women is twice as high as men. That's the rate of growth, not the absolute number, right, according to the questioner. Do you have any thoughts on or data about how women fare with records as they try to re-enter the workplace?
Yeah, it's interesting because there's been an increased focus on re-entry from women's prisons. The JBM Packaging has a program at a women's prison. I have collaborated very closely with a company called Televerde, which is based in Phoenix and runs call centers, but pays fair wages. You know, there's kind of abusive models of using, or perceived abusive models of using people in prison for labor. Like half of or more of their staff outside of prison is actually people who graduated from their prison programs, and they work exclusively with women's prisons in Arizona, Indiana, I think now North Carolina. They're expanding, and they're setting up, you know, all these training programs and things like that. So there are programs there. Women actually have worse results than men on average in terms of the ability to maintain employment. And it may not be that we don't have good data on this, but I believe it's not that they are reoffending, it's that they don't have childcare. And so the support for women, particularly women with children, is far more complicated and frankly more expensive than for, you know, men without children or women without children. And so that has led to worse results. Again, this is where nonprofits can really help fill those void, and an educated employer can help fill that void. You know, this is something that's happening across the economy as well. So it's not just people with records, but these issues are cropping up. And I think the business community is increasingly looking at ways to solve this. The same is true among women, formerly incarcerated women.
Terrific. Thank you for that answer. Last question. What would be your call to action for the audience? How do we learn more? How do we get involved? What do you suggest?
Sure. So a lot of this is, I think, being at least publicly aware that this is viable. There is a knee-jerk reaction in corporate America that this isn't even a viable economic story, that it's charity, and it's not. It's a business case. So what I hope the listeners and the GIC has taken away is that there's a business case for this. It requires a model of doing it right, and so it's not necessarily the easiest thing to accomplish, but it's we're all in, you know, so many of us are in the investment world. It's got a positive return on the investment, and it's actually a pretty high positive return. So obviously the people who can speak and vouch for this and advocate for this within their own companies, or simply as these things come up in conversation. I of course love people to buy the book and as an educational tool, and if you do, please also write a review on Amazon, because that drives those algorithms. Being aware of the kind of policies that can help, because a lot of these are political choices. How much are we investing in training within prison systems? Are we advocating for policies that help government get out of the way of employment? So cash bail has been a big problem. Someone gets arrested for a stupid misdemeanor, but it doesn't have the money to post bail, suddenly finds themselves sitting in a county jail, sometimes for months. They've never been declared guilty. They're sitting, and they have ruined their work track record. I mean, this is something that's repeated over and over again. So looking at policies like bail, community supervision, parole, and probation, we should distinguish between someone who's a low risk, and we shouldn't be interfering with their lives by making them pay supervisory fees, or disrupting their work by having a probation officer show up in the middle of the workday. These are the kind of things where we need better policies that stop interfering with employment, and so all of us are citizens in that right. So those are a couple. Prisons need books. If you have books that you can find a local books to prison, and you can find them on the internet, send them, depending on the level of commitment. Mentoring is huge, and many of these reentry organizations have opportunities for volunteer mentors across the country. That's an incredible need in this community. Helping people interview, write resumes. All of those things are really beneficial to people's outcomes. So there's a whole level of involvement, but I think it starts with some level of education and figuring out what's really going on in our system.
Great. Well, Jeff, thank you for a very insightful conversation, for spending time with the GIC community. We really appreciate it. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone for listening.
Thank you, and we'll have you back for another GIC program soon. So audience, as Jeff mentioned, his book is available. If you go to the GIC website, you'll find a link there to the publisher site, which is HarperCollins Leadership website, and they're offering up a discount code, so you can buy Jeff's book at a discount. That code is Take Charge 25. Again, the code is Take Charge. That's all uppercase, and the number 25. As a reminder, before we close, a replay of today's conversation will be available on the GIC website. And for next week, we're very excited to announce the GIC will host our 39th annual Monetary and Trade Conference. This year, the theme will explore U.S. stimulus, the interest rate environment, and the dollar. Registration is available for the AMT conference on the GIC website. To register or to learn more about the GIC, please go to www.interdependence.org. As we conclude, we encourage you to take 60 seconds to respond to our audience survey. Your feedback is very important to us. Let us know how we can improve our programming. Thank you very much for your attention. Good afternoon.